America was a revolutionary force from the day of its discovery by Europeans. The New World nurtured new ideas about the nature of society, citizens, and government. Republicanism defined a just society as one in which all citizens willingly subordinated their private selfish interests to the common good. Stability and government depended on the virtue of the citizenry. Virtue of the citizenry must have a capacity for selflessness, self-sufficiency, courage, appetite for civic involvement, and republicanism was opposed to hierarchical and authoritarian institutions such as aristocracy and monarchy. Mercantilism rested on the belief that wealth was power. A country's economic wealth and its military and political power could be measured by the amount of gold or silver in its treasury. To amass gold or silver, a country needed to export more than it imported. Colonies conferred distinct advantages. They could supply raw materials to the mother country, reducing the need for foreign imports, and could provide guaranteed markets for exports. The London government viewed American colonies as tenants. Radical Whigs were British political commentators whose ideas fundamentally shaped American political thought. They feared the threat to liberty posed by the arbitrary power of the monarch and his ministers relative to elected representatives in Parliament. They warned citizens to guard against corruption and conspiracies to take away their liberties. Americans had grown accustomed to running their own affairs. The great distance from Britain weakened royal authority. From time to time, Parliament passed laws to regulate the mercantilist system. The Navigation Law of 1650, aimed at Dutch shippers, said that all commerce flowing to and from colonies could be transported only in British, including colonial, vessels. European goods destined for America first had to land in Britain, where tariff duties could be collected and British middlemen got the profits. Other laws stipulated that American merchants must ship enumerated products, notably tobacco, exclusively to Britain, even though prices might be better elsewhere. British policy inflicted a currency shortage on the colonies. This situation forced the colonies to issue paper money. But Parliament prohibited colonial legislatures from printing paper currency. The British Crown reserved the right to nullify any legislation passed by colonial assemblies if it could harm the mercantilist system. Royal veto was rarely used, but just the idea of a veto incited colonial anger. The Female Combatants, 1776. Britain is symbolized as a lady of fashion, her rebellious daughter, America, as an Indian princess. Their shields of obedience and liberty seemed mutually exclusive standards. Paul Revere by John Singleton Copley, circa 1768. This painting of the famed silversmith horseman challenged convention. but reflected the new democratic spirit of the age by portraying an artisan in working clothes. Note how Copley depicted the serene confidence of the master craftsman and Revere's quiet pride in his work. The British mercantile system seemed oppressive, but its laws were loosely enforced. Americans also reaped direct benefits. London paid liberal bounties to colonial producers. Colonies had protection of the world's most powerful navy and a strong, seasoned army. The mercantile system burdened colonists with annoying liabilities. It stifled economic initiative and imposed a rankling dependency on British agents and creditors. Colonists found it to be debasing. They felt used and kept in a state of perpetual economic adolescence. After the 7 Years' War, Britain held one of the world's largest empires and the biggest debt. It moved to redefine its relationship with the colonies. In 1763, Prime Minister George Grenville ordered the Navy to strictly enforce the navigation laws. In 1664, he secured from Parliament the Sugar Act, the first law passed by Parliament to raise revenue for the Crown from the colonies. It increased the duty on sugar from the West Indies. After bitter protests, duties were lowered substantially, and agitation died down. Resentment renewed when the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. In 1765, the stamp tax was imposed. It aimed to raise revenue to support the new military force. It mandated the use of stamped paper or affixing of stamps certifying tax payment. Stamps were required on bills of sale for about 50 trade items. Grenville regarded these measures as reasonable. People in England paid a higher stamp tax. But Americans were angry. The new law pinched pocketbooks and seemed to strike at local liberties. Some colonists refused to comply with the Quartering Act. Some voted only to supply a fraction of the supplies requested. The acts also seemed to jeopardize the basic rights of colonists as Englishmen. Offenders were tried in admiralty courts without juries and the innocent until proven guilty concept. With the French and the Indians defeated, what need was there for a military force in the colonies? Colonists feared a conspiracy to strip them of their historic liberties. The Stamp Act became the chief target of their anger. Americans made a distinction between legislation and taxation. They conceded the right of Parliament to legislate matters related to the entire empire. They denied the right of Parliament, in which no Americans were seated, to impose taxes on Americans. Such taxes were seen as robbery. Only colonial assemblies could tax colonists. Grenville used the theory of virtual representation, that all citizens were represented by Parliament. The dispute eventually caused Americans to deny the authority of Parliament and to consider their own political independence. Colonial protest against the hated stamp tax took various forms. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 stated the rights and grievances of colonists and beseeched the king and parliament to repeal the repugnant legislation. It was ignored in England and was a significant step toward intercolonial unity. Non-importation agreements. Agreements against importing British goods with a promising stride toward union helped unite the American people for the first time in common action and gave Americans new opportunities to participate in colonial protests. The Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty took laws into their own hands and cried, "Liberty, property, and no stamps." Shaken by colonial commotion, the machinery for collecting the tax broke down. By the time the act was to go into effect in 1765, all stamp agents had been forced to resign. The boycott also hurt the British economy. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Public punishment for the exciseman, 1774. This popular rendering of the punishment of the Commissioner of Customs, John Malcolm, shows him tarred and feathered and forcibly paid with great quantities of tea. From the Liberty Tree in the background dangles the threat of hanging, all for attempting to collect duties in Boston. Parliament then passed the Declaratory Act, reaffirming its right to bind colonies in all cases whatsoever. The British government defined its constitutional principle: absolute power and unqualified sovereignty over the colonies. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed. It imposed a light import duty on glass, white lead, paper, paint, and tea. It was an indirect customs duty payable at American ports. Americans refused any taxes without representation. They were especially concerned because these taxes would pay salaries of royal governors. Non-importation agreements were renewed against Townshend Acts, but the colonists took the light new tax less seriously. They found they could get cheap tea by smuggling. To enforce the order, British then landed 2 regiments of troops in Boston in 1768. On March 5, 1770, a clash erupted that became known as the Boston Massacre. Two views of the Boston Massacre, 1770 and 1856. Both of these prints of the Boston Massacre were art as well as propaganda. Paul Revere's engraving left began circulating within 3 weeks of the event in March of 1770, depicting not a clash of brawlers, but armed soldiers taking aim at peaceful citizens. Absent also was any evidence of the mulatto ringleader Crispus Attucks. Revere wanted his print to convince viewers of the indisputable justice of the colonists' cause. By the mid-1850s, when the chromolithograph Right circulated, it served a new political purpose. In the era of the abolitionist movement, freedman Crispus Attucks held center place in the print, which portrayed his death as an American martyr in the revolutionary struggle for freedom. Crispus Attucks, a man of partial African-American descent, who in those days was referred to as a mulatto, was a leader of the mob and was one of the first to die. Both sides shared blame for the incident, but only 2 redcoats were found guilty. The soldiers were then released after being branded on the hand. By 1770, young King George III was attempting to assert the power of the monarchy. He surrounded himself with yes-men, notably his Prime Minister, Lord North. The Townshend Acts failed to generate revenue, but they did produce near rebellion. Non-importation actions hurt English economy, and the Parliament eventually repealed most Townshend duties, but kept the tax on tea. But flames of discontent continued because British officials increased efforts to enforce the navigation laws. Zealous Samuel Adams continued to incite what was called his trained mob. Adams organized first committees of correspondence in Massachusetts. Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803. A second cousin of John Adams, he contributed a potent pen and tongue to the American Revolution as a political agitator and organizer of rebellion. He was the leading spirit in hosting the Boston Tea Party. A failure in the brewing business, he was sent by Massachusetts to the First Continental Congress in 1774. He signed the Declaration of Independence and served in Congress until 1781. Portrait traditionally said to be that of Abigail Adams, 1744 to 1818. The wife of Revolutionary War leader and future President John Adams, she was a prominent patriot in her own right. She was also among the first Americans to see, however faintly, the implications of revolutionary ideas for changing the status of women. Committees of correspondence. After one was organized in Boston in 1772, some 80 towns set up similar organizations. They exchanged letters that kept alive opposition to British policy. Intercolonial correspondence committees were the next logical step. Virginia led the way in 1773. 12 other colonies soon joined the effort. They played a key role in stimulating and disseminating sentiment in favor of united action. They evolved directly into the first American Congresses. By 1773, the powerful British East India Company was facing bankruptcy. It had 17 million pounds of unsold tea. The British ministry awarded it a complete monopoly of the American tea business. It could sell its tea at a very low price. But colonists saw this as an attempt to trick them into accepting taxes. British authorities decided to enforce the law. Colonists rose up in anger, mass demonstrations forcing tea-bearing ships to return to England with their cargo. Only in Boston did a British official refuse to be cowed. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to budge. Hutchinson infuriated Boston's radicals when he ordered tea ships not to leave Boston until they had unloaded their cargoes. On December 16, 1773, about 100 Bostonians, loosely disguised as Indians, boarded the ships. They smashed open 342 chests of tea and dumped the contents into the harbor. This action became known as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773. Crying, "Boston Harbor, a teapot this night," Sons of Liberty disguised as Indians hurled chests of tea into the sea to protest the tax on tea and to make sure that its cheap price did not prove an invincible temptation to the people. Reaction varied. Sympathetic colonists applauded. Referring to tea as a badge of slavery, they burned the hated leaves in solidarity with Boston. Hutchinson, chastened and disgusted, retreated to Britain, never to return. The British chose a perilous path that led only to reprisals, bitterness, and escalating conflict. Parliament responded with measures in 1774 that brewed a revolution. It passed a series of acts to chastise colonists, especially in Boston. The acts were branded in the colonies as the Massacre of American Liberty. Most drastic was the Boston Port Act. It closed the port until damages were paid. Other intolerable acts limited rights traditionally practiced in Massachusetts. Restrictions were placed on town meetings. Unlike before, officials who killed colonists in the line of duty could now be sent to Britain for trial. The new Quartering Act gave local authorities power to lodge soldiers anywhere, even in private homes. The Quebec Act in 1774 covered French subjects in Canada. It guaranteed their Catholic religion. They could maintain institutions which did not include representative assembly or trial by jury. Quebec's boundaries extended to the Ohio River. From the French viewpoint, the Quebec Act was a shrewd and conciliatory measure. From the American viewpoint, the act was noxious. It had a much wider range. It set a dangerous precedent by denying jury trials and by allowing unrepresentative assemblies. It alarmed land speculators by snatching a huge trans-Allegheny area from their grasp. It angered anti-Catholics by extending Catholic jurisdiction south into a region about the size of the 13 colonies. American dissenters responded to the plight of Massachusetts. Colonies sent food to the stricken city of Boston. Rice was shipped from faraway South Carolina. Most memorable was the summoning of the First Continental Congress in 1774. It met in Philadelphia to redress grievances. 12 of 13 colonies, except Georgia, sent 55 men, among them Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry. Quebec before and after 1774. Young Alexander Hamilton voiced the fears of many colonists when he warned that the Quebec Act of 1774 would introduce a priestly tyranny into Canada, making that country another Spain or Portugal. "Does not your blood run cold," he asked, "to think that an English Parliament should pass an act for the establishment of arbitrary power and popery in such a country? The First Continental Congress deliberated for 7 weeks in the fall of 1774. It was not a legislative body, but a consultative body, a convention rather than a congress. John Adams played a key role. It drew up a Declaration of Rights, as well as a solemn appeal to other British colonies, to the King, and to the British people. The most significant action was creation of the Association. It called for complete boycott of British goods, non-importation and non-exportation, non-consumption, and the delegates were not calling for independence. They sought merely to repeal offensive legislation. But a fatal drift toward war continued. Parliament rejected Congress's petitions. Violators of the association were tarred and feathered. Muskets were gathered and men began to drill openly. In April of 1775, a British commander in Boston sent troops to Lexington and Concord to seize stores of gunpowder. A view of the town of Concord, circa 1775. Redcoats here drill on the Concord Green, near where colonial militiamen would soon repel their advance on stores of rebel gunpowder. Troops were also supposed to arrest ringleaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. At Lexington, Minutemen refused to disperse. Shots were fired, killing 8 Americans and wounding several more. Redcoats then pushed on to Concord, where they suffered heavy losses. Britain now had war on its hands. Americans brashly rebelled against the mighty empire. There were 7.5 million Britons as compared to 2.5 million colonists. Monetary wealth and naval power overwhelmingly favored England. Britain's professional army equaled some 50,000 men, as compared to numerous but poorly trained American militia. King George III could also hire foreign soldiers, including some 30,000 Germans called Hessians. British enrolled about 50,000 American loyalists and enlisted some Indians, yet Britain was weaker than it seemed. The oppressed Ireland required troops to maintain British control, and France was waiting to get even with Britain. The London government was weak and inept. There was no William Pitt, only stubborn George and his pliant Prime Minister, Lord North. Many Britons had no desire to kill Americans. English Whigs opposed Lord North's Tories. Whigs believed a battle for British freedom was being fought in America. Britain's army in America operated under numerous difficulties. Generals were second-rate, soldiers were brutally treated. Provisions were often scarce, rancid, and wormy. Britain had to operate 3,000 miles from home. Distance greatly increased delays and uncertainties from storms and mishaps. Military orders issued in London but received months later did not fit a changing situation. America's geographical expanse was enormous, roughly 1,000 by 600 miles. Colonies had no urban nerve centers, and British armies took every city of any size. Americans wisely traded space for time. Americans had some advantages. They had outstanding leaders like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Eventually, they had foreign aid from France. European officers volunteered to fight for pay. Marquis de Lafayette proved invaluable in securing further aid from France. And there were other conditions that aided Americans. They were fighting defensively, with odds favoring the defender. Colonies were self-sufficient in food. Americans enjoyed a moral advantage from the belief in a just cause. But American rebels were poorly organized. The Continental Congress was mostly a debating society. Disorganized colonists fought almost the entire war before adopting a constitution, the Articles of Confederation, in 1781. Jealousy hindered the war effort. Individual states, regarding themselves as sovereign, resisted attempts by Congress to exercise its powers. Sectional jealousy boiled over the appointment of military leaders, and there were economic difficulties as well. Metal money had been drained away. The Continental Congress, unwilling to raise taxes, massively printed continental paper money. Confusion proliferated when individual states issued depreciated paper money. Inflation skyrocketed prices. This youthful French officer gave to America not only military service, but some $200,000 of his private funds. He returned to France after the American Revolution to play a conspicuous role in the French Revolution. Couple with Child by Miguel Cabrera. This 18th century portrait of a Mexican family illustrates the common intermarriage of Europeans and Indians in the Spanish New World. The ethnic complexity of Spanish America kept colonists there from uniting against imperial authorities as successfully as their northern neighbors. Military supplies in colonies were scanty. In earlier years, England provided funds and weapons. Rebels were caught, the cost of home defense mounted, just as the supply of British funds and war material evaporated. Sufficient stores of gunpowder, cannon, and other armaments could not be found in agricultural colonies. Among the reasons for the alliance with France was the need for a reliable source of military supplies. At Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, soldiers went without bread for 3 days in the cruel winter of 1777 through 1778. In one campaign, some men fainted for lack of food. Manufactured goods were in short supply. Clothing and shoes were appallingly scarce. Militiamen were numerous but unreliable. They received only rudimentary training. Besides desertion, troops were hit by smallpox. Women played a significant part in the revolution. They maintained farms and businesses while fathers and husbands fought. Many female camp followers accompanied the army. They cooked and sewed in return for money and rations. One Massachusetts woman dressed in men's clothing and served in the army for 17 months. 7,000 to 8,000 regulars were finally whipped into shape by stern drill masters. German Baron von Steuben was an organizational genius. Blacks fought and died for the American cause. Many states initially barred them from the military, but eventually more than 5,000 blacks enlisted. The largest constituents came from the northern states, with substantial numbers of free blacks. Blacks fought at Trenton, Brandywine, Saratoga, and other important battles. The Flutist by Brazilla Lou. This portrait is believed to be that of an African-American fifer in the Revolutionary War. Lou was a veteran of the 7 Years' War who had marched to Ticonderoga and served in the Army a full 7 years as frontline soldier, fifer, and drummer. In 1775, at the age of 32, he fought at Bunker Hill as an enlistee in the 27th Massachusetts Regiment. A resident of Chelmsford, Massachusetts, he was said to have taught all 12 of his children to play musical instruments. African Americans also served on the British side. In November 1775, the governor of Virginia promised freedom for any slave who joined the British Army. Eventually, thousands of slaves fled to the British. At the end of the war, the British evacuated 14,000 black loyalists. Morale in the Revolutionary Army was undermined by American profiteers. They sold to the British because British could pay in gold. Speculators forced prices sky high. Some Bostonians made profits of 50% to 200%. The brutal truth: only a minority of colonists selflessly devoted themselves to the cause of independence. Seldom have so few done so much for so many. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. Their most important single action was selecting George Washington to head the army. The choice was made with considerable misgivings. He never rose above the rank of colonel. His largest command had only numbered 1,200 men. Falling short of true military genius, he would actually lose more battles than he won. However, he was gifted with outstanding powers of leadership and immense strength of character. He radiated patience, courage, self-discipline, and a sense of justice. He was trusted and insisted on serving without pay. He kept, however, a careful list of expenses, $100,000. Continental Congress chose more wisely than it knew. A war of inconsistency was fought for 14 months, from April 1775 on through July of 1776, before a fateful plunge into independence. Gradually, the tempo of the war increased. In May of 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured garrisons at Ticonderoga and Crown Point in the upper New York area. In June in 1775, the colonists seized Bunker Hill. Later in July, Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition, which professed loyalty to the Crown and begged the king to prevent further hostilities. But King George III slammed the door on all hopes of reconciliation. In August of 1775, he proclaimed the colonies in rebellion, which meant skirmishes were now treason, a hanging crime. He next hired thousands of German troops. George III needed the men. Because most of these soldiers came from the German Principality of Hesse, Americans called all German mercenaries Hessians. News of the Hessian deal shocked colonists. Hessian hirelings proved good soldiers. Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775. This British engraving conveys the vulnerability of the British regulars to attacks by American militiamen. Although a defeat for the colonists, the battle quickly proved a moral victory for the Patriots. Outnumbered and outgunned, they held their own against the British and suffered many fewer casualties. In October of 1775, the British burned Falmouth, now called Portland, Maine. In autumn, rebels undertook a two-pronged invasion of Canada. A successful assault on Canada would add a 14th colony and deprive Britain of a valuable base for striking the colonies in revolt. The invasion north was an undisguised offensive warfare, and the invasion of Canada was almost successful. General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal. At Quebec, he was joined by the army of General Benedict Arnold. The assault on Quebec was launched on the last day of 1775. Montgomery was killed and Arnold was wounded. Bitter fighting persisted in the colonies. In January of 1776, the British set fire to Norfolk, Virginia. In March, the British were forced to evacuate Boston. In the South, rebels won two victories. In February of 1776 against 15,000 Loyalists at Moore's Creek Bridge in North Carolina, and in June of 1776 against an invading fleet at Charleston Harbor. Revolution in the North, 1775 through 1776. Benedict Arnold's troops were described as pretty young men when they were sailed from Massachusetts. They were considerably less pretty on their arrival in Quebec after 8 weeks of struggling through wet and frigid forests, often without food. No one can imagine, one of them wrote, the sweetness of a roasted shot pouch, ammunition bag, to the famished appetite. Loyalty to the empire was deeply ingrained. Americans continued to believe they were part of a transatlantic community. Colonial unity was weak, and open rebellion was dangerous. As late as January of 1776, the king's health was being toasted. God save the king. Gradually, colonists were shocked into recognizing the necessity to separate. In 1776, Common Sense by Thomas Paine was written. It was one of the most influential pamphlets ever published. It began with a treatise on the nature of government. It argued only lawful states were those that derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. As for the king, he was nothing but the royal brute of Great Britain. 120,000 copies were sold in 1 week. It tried to convince colonists that the true cause was independence, not reconciliation with Britain. Nowhere in the physical universe did smaller heavenly bodies control larger ones. So why should the tiny island of Britain control the vast continent of America? Paine had drafted a foundational document of American independence and American foreign policy. Only with independence could colonies hope to gain foreign assistance. Paine called for a republic, creation of a new kind of political society where power flowed from the people. In biblical imagery, he argued all government officials, governors, senators, judges, should derive authority from popular consent. Paine was not the first to champion republican government. We've seen this in classical Greece and Rome. It was revived during the 17th century Renaissance. But it appealed to British politicians critical of excessive power in the hands of a king and his advisors. American colonists interpreted royal acts as part of a monarchical conspiracy. Paine's summons to create a republic fell on receptive ears. New Englanders practiced a kind of republicanism in town meetings and annual elections. Most Americans considered citizen virtue fundamental to any successful Republican government. Individuals in a republic must sacrifice personal self-interest to the public good. The collective good of the people mattered more than private rights and interests of individuals. Paine inspired contemporaries to view America as fertile ground for the cultivation of civic virtue. Not all patriots agreed with Paine's ultra-democratic republicanism. Some favored a republic ruled by a natural aristocracy of talent and wanted an end to hereditary aristocracy, but not an end to all social hierarchy. There were conservative Republicans who wanted stability of the social order. The contest over American republicanism would continue for the next 100 years. An inspirational appeal was needed to enlist other British colonies in the Americas, to invite assistance from foreign nations, and to rally resistance at home. Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal statement. The task of drafting fell to Thomas Jefferson. He was fully qualified for it. The Declaration of Independence, formally approved by Congress on July 4, 1776, had universal appeal by invoking natural rights of humankind, not just British rights. It argued that because the king had flouted these rights, the colonists were justified in cutting ties. It set forth a long list of presumably tyrannous misdeeds of George III. The Declaration had universal impact. King George III of England by Johann Zoffany, 1771. America's last king, he was a good man, unlike some of his scandal-tainted brothers and sons, but a bad king. Doggedly determined to regain arbitrary power for the crown, he antagonized and then lost the 13 American colonies. During much of his 60-year reign, he seemed to be insane. But recently, medical science has found that he was suffering from a rare metabolic and hereditary disease called porphyria. The War of Independence was a war within a war. Loyalists were colonists loyal to the king, who fought American rebels called Tories after the dominant political factions in Britain. Patriots were rebels who fought against the British redcoats called Whigs after opposition factions in Britain. The American Revolution was a minority movement. Many colonists were either apathetic or neutral. Patriot militias played a critical role. They took on the task of political education, sometimes by coercion. They also served as agents of revolutionary ideas. The Loyalists were about 16% of the American people. Families were often split. Many were people of education and wealth. Loyalists were more numerous among the older generation. They included the king's officers and beneficiaries, the Anglican clergy and congregations. Virginia was a notable exception to this. Loyalists were entrenched in aristocratic New York City and Charleston, and Quaker Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. They were less numerous in New England. Rebels were most numerous where Presbyterianism and Congregationalism flourished. Before the Declaration in 1776, persecution of the Loyalists was relatively mild. Some faced brutality, that's tarring and feathering, riding astride fence rails, but harsher treatment began after the Declaration of Independence. They were regarded as traitors, were roughly handled, some imprisoned, a few non-combatants were hung. However, there was no wholesale reign of terror. 80,000 Loyalists were driven out or fled. Several hundred thousand were permitted to stay. Estates of fugitives were confiscated and sold. Some 50,000 Loyalists fought for the British. They helped the king's cause by serving as spies and by inciting Indians. The British did not make effective use of the Loyalists. Loyalists through British eyes. This British cartoon depicts the Loyalists as doubly victimized by Americans characterized by savage Indians and by the British Prime Minister, the Earl of Shelburne, for offering little protection to Britain's defenders. New York patriots pull down the statue of King George III. Erected after the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, this statue was melted down by the revolutionaries into bullets to be used against the king's troops. London officials adopted an intricate scheme to capture the Hudson River Valley in 1777. If successful, it would sever New England from the rest of the states and paralyze the American cause. General John Burgoyne would push down the Lake Champlain route from Canada. General Howe's troops would advance up the Hudson and meet Burgoyne near Albany. A third force, under Colonel Barry St. Leger, would come from the west via Lake Ontario and the Mohawk Valley. The British did not reckon with General Arnold, who came along the St. Lawrence River to the Lake Champlain area where he assembled a small fleet. His fleet was destroyed, but time had been won. Without Arnold, the British would have recaptured Fort Ticonderoga. If Burgoyne could have started there instead of Montreal, he would have been successful. Saratoga ranks high among the decisive battles of both America and world history. Victory revived the faltering colonial cause. Even more important, it made possible urgently needed foreign aid from France, which in turn helped ensure American independence. France's role in the Revolution. France hoped to regain its former prestige. The loss in the 7 Years' War rankled deeply. American revolutionaries badly needed France's help to throw off the British. America needed to seal an alliance with France against the common foe. American rebels also harbored revolutionary ideas about international affairs. They wanted an end to colonialism and mercantilism. They supported free trade and freedom of the seas and wanted the rule of law, not raw power, to arbitrate affairs of nations. In the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress drafted a model treaty to guide commissioners dispatched to France. John Adams, one of the chief authors, described basic principles. 1. No political connection. 2. No military connection. And 3. Only a commercial connection. These were remarkable self-denying restrictions. It infused idealism into American foreign policy. Benjamin Franklin negotiated the treaty in Paris. He was determined that his appearance should herald a diplomatic revolution. He shocked the royal court. Ordinary Parisians adored him as a specimen of new democratic social order. The British now offered a measure allowing American home rule within the empire. This was essentially what colonists had asked for, except independence. On February 6, 1778, France offered a treaty of alliance. The young republic concluded its first entangling military alliance and would soon regret it. The Treaty of France constituted the official recognition of America's independence. Both bound themselves to secure America's freedom. Benjamin Franklin in his fabled cap. He left school at the age of 10 and became a wealthy businessman, a journalist, an inventor, a scientist, a legislator, and preeminently a statesman diplomat. He was sent to France in 1776 as the American envoy at the age of 70. And he remained there until 1785, negotiating the alliance with the French and helping to negotiate the Treaty of Peace. His fame had preceded him, and when he discarded his wig for the fur cap of a simple American agriculturalist, he took French society by storm. French aristocratic women, with whom he was a great favorite, honored him by adopting the high coiffure a la Franklin in imitation of his cap. England and France came to blows in 1778. The shot fired at Lexington widened into global conflict. Spain entered in 1779, as did Holland. The weak maritime neutrals of Europe began to demand their rights. Russia's Catherine the Great organized armed neutrality, lined up remaining European neutrals in an attitude of passive hostility toward Britain. The fighting spread in Europe and North America, as well as South America, the Caribbean, and Asia. Americans deserve credit for keeping the war going until 1778, with secret French aid. Their independence was not achieved until the conflict became a multi-power world war, too much for Britain to handle. From 1778 to 1783, France provided rebels with guns, money, equipment, and armed forces. With France's entrance, it forced British to change basic strategy. They had counted on blockading the colonial coast and commanding the seas. The French now had a powerful fleet in American waters. The British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate strength in the New York City area. In June of 1778, the Redcoats were attacked by Washington. The battle was indecisive, and Washington remained in New York. In 1780, a French army of 6,000 regular troops under Commander Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Newport. French gold and goodwill helped melt suspicions. There was no real military advantage yet from the French reinforcements. Also in 1780, General Benedict Arnold turned traitor. The British planned to roll up the colonies, starting in the Loyalist South. Georgia was overrun in 1778 through 1779. Charleston fell in 1780. Warfare intensified in the Carolinas. In 1781, American riflemen wiped out the British at Kings Mountain, then defeated a smaller force at Cowpens. In the Carolina campaign, General Nathanael Greene distinguished himself by his strategy of delay. By standing and then retreating, he exhausted his foe, General Cornwallis. In vain pursuit, Greene succeeded in clearing most of Georgia and South Carolina of British troops. The West was ablaze during the war. Indian allies of England attacked the colonists. 1777 was known as the Bloody Year on the frontier. Two nations of Iroquois confederacy, the Oneidas and the Tuscarora, sided with the Americans. The Senecas, Mohawks, Cayugas, Onondagas joined the British, encouraged by Chief Joseph Brant, who believed victorious Britain would restrain white expansion west. In 1784, pro-British Iroquois were forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the first treaty between the United States and an Indian nation. Under its terms, Indians ceded most of their land. In Illinois, the British were vulnerable to attack. They held only scattered posts captured from the French. George Rogers Clark conceived the idea of seizing these forts by surprise. In 1778 through 1779, he quickly captured Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Clark's admirers have argued his success later forced the British to cede the region north of the Ohio River to the United States at the peace table in Paris. America's infant navy was commanded under Scotsman John Paul Jones. His tiny force never made a dent in Britain's massive fleet. His chief contribution was destroying the British merchant shipping and carried war into the waters around the British Isles. Privateers privately owned armed ships and were legalized pirates. Authorized by Congress to attack enemy ships, 1,000 American privateers responded to the call of patriotism and profit with about 70,000 men. They captured some 600 British prizes, while the British captured the same number of merchantmen and privateers. Privateering was not an unalloyed asset. It diverted manpower from the main war and involved Americans in speculation and graft. Privateering was also good, for it brought in urgently needed gold and harassed the enemy. It also raised American morale and ruined British shipping. Shippers and manufacturers wanted to end the war. One of the darkest periods of the war was between 1780 and 1781, before the last decisive victory. The government was virtually bankrupt and declared it would repay debt at only 2.5 cents per dollar. Despair prevailed, a sense of unity withered, mutinous sentiments infected the army. But Cornwallis blundered into a trap. After futile operations in Virginia, he fell back to Chesapeake Bay at Yorktown. There, he awaited seaborne supplies and reinforcements because he assumed Britain still controlled the seas. During this period, British naval superiority slipped away. French actions. Admiral de Grasse informed Americans he could join them against Cornwallis at Yorktown. Washington then made a swift march of 300 miles from New York to Chesapeake, accompanied by Rochambeau's French army. Washington beset the British at land, while de Grasse blockaded the sea. Cornered, Cornwallis surrendered his entire fleet of 7,000 men on October 19, 1781. George III planned to continue the struggle, and fighting continued for a year after Yorktown, with savage patriot-loyalist warfare in the South. Washington's most valuable contributions were to keep the cause alive, the army in the field, and the states together. The aftermath of war. Many Britons were weary of war. They suffered losses in India and the West Indies. The island of Minorca and the Mediterranean fell. Lord North's ministry collapsed in March of 1782, temporarily ending George III's personal rule. The Whig ministry, favorable to the Americans, replaced the Tory regime of Lord North. American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay gathered at Paris. They were instructed to make no separate peace and to consult with French allies at all stages of negotiation. American representatives chafed under the directive. They knew it had been written by a subservient Congress under pressure from the French Foreign Office. But France was in a difficult position. They had induced Spain to enter the war. Spain coveted the immense Trans-Allegheny area. France desired an independent United States, but wanted to keep the new republic east of the Allegheny Mountains. A weak America would be easier to manage in promoting French interests and policy. But France was paying a heavy price to win America's independence and wanted her money's worth. John Jay was unwilling to play the French game and secretly made overtures to London. London came to terms with the Americans. A preliminary treaty was signed in 1782. A formal Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and granted generous boundaries to the Mississippi on the west, to the Great Lakes north, and to Spanish Florida to the south. The Yankees retained access to the fisheries of Newfoundland. The American concessions. Loyalists were not to be further persecuted. Congress was to recommend to the states that confiscated Loyalist property be restored, debts owed to British creditors be paid. The British concessions were to accept defeat in North America. Ending war allowed England to rebuild. British terms were liberal. It granted the enormous Trans-Appalachian area to the United States. In spirit, Americans made a separate peace, contrary to the French alliance. But France was relieved with the end of the costly conflict. America alone gained from the world-girdling war and began a national career with splendid territorial birthrights and a priceless heritage.